They called human music barbaric, too loud, too wild, too full of raw emotion they didn't understand. The alien leaders said it was dangerous, that it could infect their people's hearts with strange passions. But then, one human stood alone on a silent stage, played a single trembling song, and in that moment, an entire alien race felt their walls shatter. They wept, they rose together, they embraced a unity they'd never known. That day, they learned human music wasn't barbaric at all, it was the language that finally brought them all home. She stood trembling in the great marble hall, her dark violet eyes darting over the assembly of officials and elders that stretched endlessly before her. Kyra had always believed her people were the pinnacle of refinement, elegant, orderly, proud beyond measure. They glided through life with delicate gestures and a cold composure that shunned anything wild or unpredictable. Music existed here, yes, but it was distant and clinical, a quiet accompaniment to state dinners or meditative walks, nothing more than sterile tones designed to soothe the mind rather than stir the heart. The girl had trained since childhood to become a diplomat, rehearsing each subtle movement of her slender fingers, each careful dip of her chin, each calm modulation of her voice. Emotions were a weakness, and she had spent her entire life erasing them, until today.
Today they had come. The humans.
When they first arrived in gleaming ships that roared like star lions, her people recoiled. Kyra still remembered the council's decree: humans are untamed creatures, driven by noise and blood and primitive art. Their music is a threat to civilization itself.
She should have agreed.
But when she heard their voices echoing down the long metal corridors of the diplomatic dock, she felt something coil tightly in her chest.
She felt awake.
Kyra had been chosen to translate for them during the first cultural exchange. Her hands shook as she reviewed the prepared text, an explanation of why their traditions forbid violent auditory expressions. But as the human delegation filed in, something unexpected happened. One of them, a man with a rough jacket covered in old patches, a battered instrument case slung over his shoulder, stepped forward. His eyes scanned the chamber, bright and restless. He looked nothing like the polished envoys she had met before. He opened the case and withdrew a strange wooden object with metal strings. Kyra gasped softly. It was called a guitar, she remembered from her studies. The elders all rose at once, scandalized.
Barbarian! One shouted.
Another flicked her hand toward the guards, a silent command to remove him. But the human ignored them. He sat on the marble floor, no dignity, no protocol, and strummed a single chord that rang out like a sudden sunrise. Kyra's entire body flinched. A shock coursed through her veins, so raw she almost doubled over.
Another chord. A pause. Then he began to sing.
At first, it was just sound, deep and ragged, impossible to control or confine. But as his voice wove around the chords, it became a story. A lonely cry across the void. A song of empty nights and distant stars, of friends lost to war and the warmth of hands held tight in the dark. Kyra's throat closed, her heart pounding in her fragile chest. She felt her face heat up, felt the sting in her eyes. Her hands flew to her cheeks, she was crying. She, the most disciplined apprentice in the entire cast. Around her, the elders stumbled backward. One covered his ears, shaking his head as if struck. Another knelt down, clutching her chest, her composure dissolving. One by one, they all fell silent, utterly powerless before the tidal wave of the human's voice. Kyra staggered forward without meaning to. She fell to her knees beside him, her delicate robes bunching in the dust. The human looked at her, a soft smile curling on his lips as he sang the final line. Something about hope, about dawn beyond the blackest night. When he finished, the silence crashed down.
No one dared breathe.
Then Kyra found her voice, trembling and small.
Again, she whispered. The human tilted his head, surprised.
Please, she said, her voice breaking now.
Sing it again.
She turned toward the elders, her eyes red, her hair tangled. You call this barbaric, she said, her voice echoing off the marble walls. But what if this is the soul we lost long ago?
Some looked away in shame.
Some wept openly now, shoulders shaking. A few simply stood in stunned, wordless awe. As he began again, Kyra reached out and touched the strings with her delicate fingers, feeling the vibrations rush up her arm like liquid fire. Later, they would say it started here, on that cold marble floor, in the oldest hall of a people who had forgotten how to feel. When one human dared to sing the truth, an entire world cracked open. News spread like wildfire. From the Capitol domes to the farthest ice colonies, recordings of the song blared in secret meetings, behind shuttered windows, and finally in the open streets. Merchants began to hum softly as they worked. Soldiers tapped out the rhythm against their armor. Children, once trained to keep their voices hushed, now shrieked and laughed in wild harmony. Kyra became a symbol, her tear-streaked face on countless screens. She stood next to the human when he performed in the great squares, her voice trembling as she learned each lyric, each chord. Together, they taught thousands to sing. Old politicians raged. They called it an infection, a madness. They demanded silence. But the songs kept coming, more voices, more instruments, more souls daring to feel. Years later, historians would call it the Great Awakening. An entire race, unmoored from rigid serenity, discovered a new heartbeat in the crashing chords and soaring verses. And in the center of it all stood Kyra, no longer the perfect diplomat, but a woman reborn, her voice echoing across the cosmos. She looked at the human beside her, hands still on his guitar. He smiled at her with gentle pride. "You've given them more than music," she whispered. "You've given them themselves." He only shrugged, strumming a soft, playful chord. And Kyra, once the quietest, most delicate voice in the galaxy, threw her head back and laughed, her sound ringing high and bright as starlight. 1. The dawn after that first forbidden concert came with a hush more profound than any her people had known. Kyra rose from the cot in the small diplomatic chamber, her head still echoing with that final chord. Outside, the once perfect city of polished stone and silent streets was changing. She could hear it, the tentative rhythms, stray humming that drifted like birdsong through the corridors. She turned to the human. Marcus, he had finally told her his name last night as they sat in a circle of flickering candles. She had repeated it over and over, each syllable feeling almost too raw, too alive for her lips. "Marcus," she whispered now, watching him as he carefully tuned his battered guitar. He glanced at her and grinned, a boyish spark in his eyes despite the diplomatic crisis he'd ignited. "Morning, princess," he teased softly. "Don't call me that," she snapped, but her cheeks flushed a gentle lavender. "I'm no princess. Not anymore." He only winked. "Fair enough. Then, my first student." Kyra almost laughed. Just days ago, she would have recoiled from such open familiarity, from the thought of being called a student in something so undignified as music. But now? The title felt like an honor. She knelt beside him and hesitated. He gently nudged the guitar toward her. "Go ahead." "I'll guide you," he said. Her blue fingers brushed the strings, and she felt the vibrations surge up her arms, humming against her bones. When she plucked her first awkward note, it rang out unevenly, a pitiful cry that made her flinch. Marcus only nodded encouragingly. "Again," he said, his voice firm and kind all at once. She tried again. And again. Each note a small rebellion against a lifetime of stillness and sterile perfection. Hours passed in a blur of trembling fingers and hoarse whispers. By midday, Kyra could string together a few simple chords, her shoulders quaking with each effort. Outside, rumors spread like wildfire. A crowd began to gather beneath the great balcony overlooking the city square. At first, it was just the children, those who had always been least afraid of breaking rules. Their wide, shimmering eyes turned toward the balcony, hoping for the impossible. Then came the young scholars, once the strictest guardians of etiquette, now humming scraps of Marcus's song under their breath. Then the guards themselves, armor still gleaming but hands tapping rhythm on their knees. When Kyra finally stepped onto the balcony that afternoon, they saw a different woman. Her robes were wrinkled, her once impeccable hair loose around her shoulders. The guitar Marcus handed her looked too large for her slender frame, but she held it as though it were a sword. She scanned the sea of faces below. Every eye watched her, trembling between fear and desperate longing. Then she strummed. One broken, uncertain chord. The echo rang out, a hush flooding the square. A second chord. Wobbly but real. By the third, the hush had transformed into a soft collective breath, a single organism holding itself still, waiting to live or die by the next note. Finally, she began to sing. It wasn't perfect. Her voice cracked, the alien accents twisting the human words strangely. But she sang of loss and longing, of how her people had traded their hearts for cold grace, of how a single human dared to show her that rawness was not weakness, but the core of being alive. As the final note faded, no one cheered. No one clapped. Instead, tears flowed down countless cheeks, shimmering like pale rain. Then one voice rose, a young boy's shrill, defiant shout. Again. The crowd gasped, turning to him. He shook, expecting punishment. But Kyra smiled, wide and brilliant. "Yes," she called back, her voice echoing from the marble columns. Again. She played again. This time, some began to sway. Some tried to hum along. Others covered their faces and wept openly. Marcus joined her on the balcony then, sliding his own guitar into the melody. Their sounds wove together, alien and human, a wild tapestry that defied every law her people had enforced for centuries. Below, a few in uniform hesitated, hands on their stun batons. But they faltered. One guard dropped his weapon, falling to his knees as his chest convulsed in sobs. Another simply let the baton clatter to the ground and pressed a hand to his heart, eyes closed. After that day, the song spread faster than any official decree ever had. At first, they sang in secret, behind closed doors and under moonlit arches. But as days turned to weeks, the private songs turned into street gatherings. Young and old alike gathered with makeshift instruments, strips of metal wired together, hollowed-out crates, anything that could echo a note. Kyra and Marcus led them. They traveled to the outer districts, where workers had once been forbidden to speak above a whisper. There, they taught farmers to stomp out rhythms in muddy fields, taught miners to harmonize over the rumble of drills. Kyra watched in wonder as even the most rigid elders, who had once demanded total silence at every mealtime and festival, slowly lowered their heads, listening to the stories hidden in the chords. One night, in a half-finished amphitheater on the city's edge, a former council elder shuffled up to Kyra. His once pristine white robe was dusty, and his silver eyes were red-rimmed. I thought music would shatter us," he croaked. Kyra laid a gentle hand on his shoulder.
"It did," she said.
"It shattered the walls around our hearts." The elder let out a strangled laugh that turned into a sob. Then he pressed his forehead to hers, a gesture once reserved for the most sacred diplomatic treaties. In the months that followed, the changes became irreversible. A former council hall was turned into a music school. What had been endless rows of administrative desks became open circles of cushions and stringed instruments. Children no longer learned only calculus and etiquette, they learned folk ballads, they learned to scream into the sky, they learned to feel. Kyra took her place at the center of this movement, though she insisted on remaining a student forever. She refused the title of High Conductor, even when offered. She refused golden robes, jewels, political honors. All she wanted was to sing with Marcus and their students, to feel the resonance of voices rising around her, lifting her higher than her ancestors could have dreamed. Years later, when the first joint human-alien orchestra performed on the great crystal stage orbiting the twin moons, Kyra stood at the front, her guitar strapped across her shoulder. The audience, a mixed sea of humans and aliens alike, fell silent as she raised her hands. She looked to her left, Marcus older now, hair shot through with gray, but his grin just as reckless. She looked at the children beside them, holding alien-made violins and human percussion drums, ready to tear apart the void with their song. Kyra closed her eyes and breathed deeply. In that breath, she saw every moment that had led here, her first trembling chord, the first tear sliding down her cheek, the first elder to drop his baton and surrender to the music. She saw the human who taught her not just music, but what it meant to be alive. Finally, she lowered her hands and struck the opening chord. Sound exploded into the dark of space, rolling in a tidal wave across the audience and beaming out toward the stars. And in that great cosmic echo, Kyra heard the truth she had always longed for. That they were not fragile or broken, or barbaric for loving something as wild and uncontainable as music. That feeling deeply was not a flaw, but the strongest bond between all souls, human or alien. That in the end, a song could unite worlds more surely than any weapon, treaty, or polished speech. As the final note hung suspended in the void, Kyra turned to Marcus and whispered, her voice still raw, still trembling with the first day's wonder. "Thank you for not staying silent." He only squeezed her hand. And together they bowed, not as diplomats, not as saviors, but simply as two beings who had dared to sing. The entire audience rose as one.
Some wept. Some roared with joy.
Others simply stood in awed silence, finally free to feel every note as it crashed over them. And so the song continued, echoing out beyond the moons, past the silver drift of satellites, and deeper into the galaxy, where new listeners might hear and learn that sometimes, the greatest revolution begins not with a sword or a law, but with a single, imperfect chord played by trembling fingers.